Sometimes a man's worst mistake becomes his greatest blessing. Sometimes the person the world sees as broken is the one who holds the power to heal your soul. When wealthy cattle baron Beau Remington made a drunken bet to court the loneliest woman in Bitter Creek, he thought he was just proving his charm. The townsfolk pointed him toward Ruthie Bell, a silent, weathered woman who kept to the shadows. What started as a cruel wager became something neither expected. As Beau spent time with Ruthie, he discovered a woman of grace, intelligence, and mystery. But when her true identity was revealed, it shook the very foundations of everything he believed about love and second chances. What secret was Ruthie hiding that would leave a confident millionaire cowboy completely speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1887 found Bitter Creek, Montana Territory, caught between the dying breath of the old frontier and the steady march of civilization. Main Street stretched like a weathered scar through the heart of the settlement, flanked by false-fronted buildings that had seen better days and better men. The Copper Dollar Saloon anchored one end of the street, its batwing doors forever swinging with the comings and goings of ranchers, drifters, and dreamers. At the other end stood the whitewashed Methodist church, its modest steeple reaching toward heaven like a prayer carved from pine and hope. Between these two poles of human nature, the people of Bitter Creek lived their measured lives. They were hardy folk, shaped by harsh winters and harder truths, their faces bearing the lines that come from squinting into prairie wind and staring down uncertainty. Most had come west, carrying nothing but ambition and the clothes on their backs, and those who survived learned that respect was earned one honest day at a time. Into this world rode Beauregard Beau Remington III, though he went by just Beau among the common folk, a concession to democracy that cost him nothing and bought him everything. At 32, he possessed the kind of easy confidence that came from never having wanted for anything. His black stallion, Thunder, was worth more than most men in Bitter Creek saw in a year, and his silver spurs caught the morning light like captured stars. Beau's cattle empire stretched across 3 counties, and his brand, a flowing R that looked like a river, marked nearly 10,000 head of prime beef. He cut a striking figure as he rode down Main Street that crisp October morning, his white hat set at just the right angle to catch the lady's attention. His coat was tailored wool from Chicago, and the silver hip flask tucked into his vest pocket caught the light when he moved. That flask had been his grandfather's, engraved with the Remington family crest, and it held the finest Kentucky bourbon money could buy. Today, as most days, it would prove both his confidence and his downfall. The townspeople paused in their daily routines to watch him pass. Sarah Whitman stopped hanging laundry on her line behind the general store, her hands still clutching a damp shirt. Old Pete McCready looked up from shoeing a horse outside his smithy, his hammer suspended mid-swing. Even the children playing marbles in the dusty street grew quiet, sensing something significant in the air. Beau tipped his hat to the ladies and nodded to the men with the casual grace of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. He tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the Copper Dollar and stepped through the batwing doors like he owned the place, which, truth be told, he could have bought without much thought. The saloon smelled of tobacco, whiskey, and the dreams of men who worked with their hands. Sawdust covered the floor, and a battered piano sat silent in the corner, waiting for evening and the return of Molly McGrath, whose voice could make even the hardest cowboy think of home. The bar itself was a work of art, carved from a single massive oak and polished to a warm honey glow by countless elbows and whispered secrets. "Well, I'll be," called out Jake Morrison, the saloon keeper, his voice carrying the hint of Ireland that 30 years in America hadn't quite erased. "If it ain't the Cattle King himself, what brings you down from your palace on the hill, your majesty?" Bo laughed, a sound like coins clinking in a prosperous man's pocket. "Now, Jake, you know I'm just a simple rancher, trying to make an honest living." He pulled out the silver flask and set it on the bar with a satisfying thunk. "Though I reckon I've done well enough to stand around for any man present who's honest enough to drink with me." A cheer went up from the handful of cowboys nursing morning coffee, and the hair of the dog that bit them. These were good men, mostly, ranch hands and small farmers who knew the value of $1 because they'd worked for everyone. They gathered around Bo like iron filings to a magnet, drawn by his easy generosity and the stories that always seemed to follow in his wake. "Tell us, Bo," said Charlie Henderson, a grizzled cowpoke who'd ridden with some of the best outfits in the territory. "What's a man like you need with us working folk? Surely you got better company up at that fancy spread of yours." Bo took a swig from his flask and felt the bourbon warm him from the inside out. "Charlie, my friend, money can buy you a lot of things, but it can't buy you real friendship or honest conversation. Besides," he added with a grin that had charmed senators' daughters and saloon girls alike, "I figured it was time I got to know my neighbors better. Man can't live on beef and bank statements alone." The conversation flowed as freely as Jake's whiskey, touching on cattle prices, weather prospects, and the latest news from the territorial capital. But as the morning wore on and the flask made its rounds, the talk grew more personal, more boastful. It was Charlie who first mentioned the ladies of Bitter Creek, wondering aloud if any of them might catch the eye of the famous bachelor rancher. "Truth is," Bo said, his voice carrying the slight blur that comes with good bourbon and better company, "I've never met a woman I couldn't charm into a dance or a dinner if I set my mind to it. Money helps, sure enough, but there's something to be said for knowing how to treat a lady with proper respect and attention." "Is that so?" piped up young Tommy Garrett, barely old enough to shave, but full of the kind of mischief that keeps small towns interesting. "Any woman, you say?" Bo straightened up, his pride engaged now like a gear in a well-oiled machine. "Any woman with sense enough to recognize a gentleman when she sees one." The men exchanged glances, the kind that passes between conspirators and fools. Jake Morrison leaned across the bar, his eyes twinkling with the possibility of entertainment. "Well, now, that's quite a claim. Quite a claim indeed." "It's not a claim," Bo said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man who'd never been refused anything by anyone. "It's a simple fact of nature." Tommy grinned, showing teeth that still held the memory of boyhood. "Care to make it interesting?" And there it was, the moment that would change everything, hanging in the tobacco-scented air like smoke from a just-fired gun. Bo felt the familiar thrill of a challenge, the same feeling that had driven him to build his empire and tame his corner of the frontier. He took another drink from the flask, feeling the bourbon settle warm and confident in his belly. "What did you have in mind, son?" "Simple wager," Tommy said, his voice carrying the practiced innocence of youth-planning mischief. "You pick any woman in Bitter Creek and convince her to be your lady for the Founders' Day supper next week. If you can do it, we'll each put up $10 to say you're the charming man you claim to be." Bo laughed, already counting his winnings. "That's hardly sporting, Tommy. Might as well ask me to prove the sun rises in the east." "Ah, but here's the catch," Charlie added, his weathered face creasing into a grin that spoke of many years watching human nature unfold. "We get to pick the lady." The saloon grew quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of a freight wagon rumbling down Main Street. Bo felt his confidence waver for just a moment, like a candle flame in a sudden breeze, before settling back into its steady burn. "Any woman in Bitter Creek?" he asked. "Any woman," Tommy confirmed. "And if I succeed, you'll admit that Beauregard Remington is indeed a man of considerable charm." "We'll shout it from the church steeple," Jake promised. Bo extended his hand, and Tommy shook it with the enthusiasm of youth, about to witness something memorable. "Then, gentlemen, you have yourself a bet." The men huddled together like generals planning a campaign, their voices dropping to excited whispers. Bo sipped his bourbon and gazed out the saloon window at the street beyond, where ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware that one of their number was about to become the center of an extraordinary wager. When the men turned back to him, their faces wore the satisfied expression of cats who'd cornered a particularly fat mouse. "Ruthie Bell," Charlie announced, with the solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence. "We choose Ruthie Bell." The name fell into the silence, like a stone into still water, sending ripples of unease through the gathered men. Even in a territory where eccentrics were as common as sagebrush, Ruthie Bell stood apart. She was the woman who walked the edges of town like a shadow, wrapped always in a worn brown shawl that had seen better decades. Nobody could remember the last time she'd spoken to anyone, and her grey hair hung in lank strands around a face that seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains. Bo felt his confidence slip another notch, but his pride was fully engaged now, and pride had always been both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. He thought of his grandfather's silver flask, warm in his pocket, and the generations of Remington men who'd never backed down from a challenge. "Ruthie Bell it is," he said, his voice steady as bedrock. "When's this Founder's Day supper you mentioned?" "1 week from Saturday," Tommy said, barely able to contain his glee. Bo finished the last of his bourbon and tucked the flask back into his vest. "Then, gentlemen, I suggest you start polishing those $10 pieces. I'll be collecting them come Sunday morning, along with your humble apologies." He tipped his hat to the assembled company and walked out into the afternoon sunshine, his boots ringing confident on the wooden boardwalk. Behind him, the saloon erupted in laughter and excited conversation as the men contemplated what they'd just witnessed. But Bo's confidence was already beginning its slow transformation into something else, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but that tasted like uncertainty, mixed with the lingering sweetness of Kentucky bourbon. As he untied Thunder and swung up into the saddle, he caught sight of a figure across the street, moving like smoke between the buildings. Ruthie Bell, wearing her eternal brown shawl and the kind of solitude that seemed to push the very air away from her. For just a moment, their eyes met across the dusty expanse of Main Street, and Bo felt something he'd never experienced before, the first faint whisper of doubt about his own invincibility. The flask in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, like it was filled with lead instead of liquid courage. 3 days passed before Bo worked up the courage to approach Ruthie Bell, though he would never have admitted to needing courage for anything. He told himself he was simply planning his strategy, the way a good businessman studies a contract before signing. But the truth gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. Every time he'd caught sight of her shadowy figure moving through town, something in his chest had tightened with an unfamiliar sensation. On Wednesday morning, he found her where he'd expected, tending the small vegetable garden behind the abandoned Hutchins place. The property had stood empty for 3 years, ever since old Samuel Hutchins died without heir or explanation, but someone had been keeping the garden alive. Bo dismounted Thunder and approached the weathered fence, his boots crunching on the frost-brittle grass. Ruthie knelt among the late-season vegetables, her worn leather gloves moving with surprising gentleness as she harvested the last of the autumn carrots. The gloves were cracked and stained, but they fit her hands with the kind of familiarity that spoke of long years together. Something about the way she handled the earth, with reverence rather than mere utility, made Bo pause at the gate instead of striding confidently forward as he'd planned. "Morning, Miss Bell," he called out, his voice carrying across the small space between them. She looked up slowly, and for the second time in 3 days, Bo found himself captured by her eyes. They were grey-green like sage after rain, and they held depths that seemed to go on forever. Her face was weathered, yes, and lined by whatever sorrows had brought her to this solitary life. But there was an intelligence there that hit him like a physical force. "Mr. Remington," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear as mountain water. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and the sound contained layers he hadn't expected: education, refinement, and a sadness so profound it made his chest ache. "I was wondering," he began, then stopped, suddenly aware that his usual charm felt clumsy and inappropriate in this place. "That is, I was hoping you might do me the honor of accompanying me to the Founder's Day supper." Ruthie Bell set down her handful of carrots and studied him with the kind of attention usually reserved for reading fine print. Her silence stretched between them like a held breath, and Bo felt sweat gathering under his collar despite the cool morning air. "Why?" she asked finally. The simple question caught him completely off guard. In his experience, women either accepted his invitations with fluttered eyelashes and excited chatter, or declined with elaborate explanations and clear regret. None had ever asked why with such direct simplicity. "Because," he said, then stopped again, realizing he couldn't very well mention the bet. "Because I think you might be interesting company." Something flickered in those sage-green eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. "I haven't been to a social gathering in 10 years, Mr. Remington. I'm not certain I remember how to behave in polite society." "Maybe polite society could learn something from you instead," he heard himself saying, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Ruthie studied him for another long moment, her weathered hands still cradling the garden carrots like small treasures. Then, to his amazement and growing confusion, she nodded. "Very well," she said. "I accept your invitation." Bo felt a rush of triumph that was immediately followed by something much more complicated, a responsibility he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he wanted. "Shall I call for you Saturday evening?" "I'll meet you at the church hall," Ruthie said firmly. 6 o'clock. She turned back to her garden, clearly dismissing him, and Bo found himself walking back to Thunder with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just agreed to something much more significant than a simple wager. As he rode back toward town, he couldn't shake the image of those intelligent eyes or the way her voice had carried decades of careful thought in just a few simple words. The news of Ruthie Bell's acceptance spread through Bitter Creek faster than wildfire in dry grass. By Thursday morning, the entire town buzzed with speculation about what Bo Remington was really up to. Some folks figured he was just showing off, proving he could charm even the most unlikely woman in the territory. Others whispered that maybe he'd lost his mind, or that his cattle empire was in trouble and he needed distraction. But it was Widow Harriet Osgood who voiced what many were thinking as she selected fabric at Morrison's general store. "Mark my words," she said to anyone within earshot, "that poor woman doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. Rich men don't court women like Ruthie Bell for any good reason. The whispers followed Beau wherever he went, and he found himself growing increasingly irritated by the town's assumptions. When Charlie Henderson made a joke about Beauty and the Beast in the saloon Thursday evening, Beau's response was sharp enough to cut the laughter short. "Maybe some of you ought to mind your own business," he said, his voice carrying the kind of edge that made men remember he employed half the territory and could buy the other half. But Friday afternoon brought a challenge to his newfound protectiveness that tested both his patience and his growing confusion about his own motivations. He was leaving the bank when he overheard a conversation between two ranch wives that stopped him cold. "I heard she talks to herself in that garden," Mrs. Peterson was saying to her companion. "Just carries on whole conversations with nobody there. My Harold says she's touched in the head, probably from living alone so long." "Well, I think it's shameful what that Remington man is doing," replied Mrs. Clayton, her voice heavy with disapproval. "Getting that poor woman's hopes up just for his own amusement. She'll be the laughingstock of the whole territory when he's done with her." Beau stepped around the corner, his presence causing both women to step back, with expressions somewhere between guilt and defiance. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I couldn't help but overhear your concern for Miss Bell's welfare. How thoughtful of you to worry about someone you've never bothered to speak to in 10 years. Mrs. Peterson's face flushed red as autumn leaves. "Now see here, Mr. Remington—" "No, ma'am," Beau interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from never having been crossed. "I think you see here. Miss Bell is a lady deserving of the same respect you'd want for yourselves, and anyone suggesting otherwise might find themselves unwelcome at establishments where I hold influence." The women hurried away with flustered protestations, but Beau found no satisfaction in their retreat. Instead, he was left standing on the boardwalk, wondering when exactly he'd stopped thinking of Ruthie Bell as the object of a wager and started thinking of her as someone who needed defending. That evening, he sat in his study at the ranch, staring out the window toward the lights of Bitter Creek and thinking about damaged daguerreotypes. He'd noticed the small, framed photograph tucked among the vegetables in Ruthie's garden, an old family portrait, water-stained and faded beyond clear recognition, but carefully propped where she could see it while she worked. There was a story there, he realized, a story that had nothing to do with the simple narrative the town had constructed around the strange woman who kept to herself. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that accepting her company to the Founder's Day supper had committed him to something far more complex than winning a bet with the boys at the saloon. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made even cynics believe in divine providence. The air was crisp enough to require a jacket, but warm enough to remember summer, and the aspens on the hillsides blazed gold against the deep blue sky. Beau spent the afternoon in preparations that felt far more significant than they should have, shaving with extra care, selecting his finest coat, polishing his boots until they gleamed like black mirrors. The silver flask went into his vest pocket as always, but today it felt less like liquid courage and more like a reminder of the man he'd been just a week ago, confident, uncomplicated, certain of his place in a world that made sense. As 6 o'clock approached, he made his way to the church hall with footsteps that seemed to echo with something approaching destiny. The building buzzed with the warm light and cheerful voices of the entire community gathered for their annual celebration, but Beau's attention was focused entirely on the slight figure waiting by the entrance. Ruthie Bell had transformed herself in ways that defied explanation. Her dress was simple but clean, a dark blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and her grey hair was pulled back in a style that revealed the elegant line of her neck, She wore the same worn leather gloves, but somehow they now seemed like a deliberate choice rather than a necessity. When she looked up at his approach, Beau felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement. "Miss Bell," he said, offering his arm. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Remington," she replied, and her voice carried a warmth that made him wonder what other surprises this night might hold. As they entered the hall together, the conversations didn't stop exactly, but they took on the careful quality that comes when people are trying to watch without being obvious about it. Beau felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispered speculations, and found himself moving protectively closer to the woman beside him. But it was Ruthie who surprised him again. Instead of shrinking from the attention, she straightened her shoulders and met the curious gazes with calm dignity, like a queen acknowledging her subjects. There was something in her bearing that spoke of different times, different circumstances, different expectations. The evening was about to begin in earnest, and Beau was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about Ruthie Bell, and about himself, was wrong. The Founders' Day supper unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dance of small-town society, with everyone knowing their steps and their place in the grand design. The church hall had been transformed with autumn decorations, corn stalks bundled in the corners, pumpkins arranged on gingham-covered tables, and the warm glow of kerosene lamps casting golden circles against the approaching darkness. Beau guided Ruthie to a table near the center of the room, acutely aware of every whispered conversation that paused as they passed. He pulled out her chair with the same courtesy he'd shown to senators' daughters in Denver, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed her weathered face into something approaching beautiful. "This is quite lovely," Ruthie said, her voice carrying across the table with perfect clarity. "I'd forgotten how welcoming this community could be when it chose to." The comment carried layers that Beau was beginning to recognize as characteristic of everything Ruthie said. There was history there, and memory, and perhaps a touch of irony that suggested she saw more than she let on. Pastor Williams approached their table with the determined cheerfulness of a man whose job it was to see the best in everyone. "Miss Bell, how wonderful to see you joining us this evening. It's been far too long since you've graced our community gatherings." "Pastor Williams," Ruthie replied with a gracious nod, "your sermons carry well on the Sunday wind. I've heard many of them from my garden." The pastor's eyebrows rose slightly at this revelation, but his smile remained warm. "Well then, you know you're always welcome to hear them from inside as well." As the evening progressed, Beau found himself in the peculiar position of discovering that his assumptions about Ruthie Bell had been not just wrong, but spectacularly misguided. When Mrs. Fitzgerald mentioned the difficulty of teaching her youngest to read, Ruthie offered a suggestion about phonetic methods that demonstrated not just familiarity with educational theory, but deep understanding of how children's minds worked. "I find," Ruthie said, her hands resting calmly on the table beside a hand-carved wooden box she'd brought as her contribution to the community auction, "that children learn best when the lessons connect to something they already love. If young Timothy enjoys helping his father with the horses, perhaps stories about horses might make the letters more interesting to him." Mrs. Fitzgerald stared at Ruthie, as if seeing her for the first time. "Why, that's exactly what his teacher in Billings suggested when we lived there. How did you—" She stopped herself, clearly realizing she was about to ask questions that might prove uncomfortable. But Beau was asking himself the same questions. How did a woman who supposedly lived in isolation know about modern educational methods? How did someone who rarely spoke in public possess such eloquent command of language? And why did everything about her manner suggest familiarity with social situations far more sophisticated than anything Bitter Creek had to offer? The wooden box beside her plate provided another puzzle. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings that spoke of skilled hands and considerable time. The wood itself was cherry, polished to a warm glow, and the brass hinges were the kind of detail work that cost serious money. When the auction began and various items were presented for bidding, Ruthie quietly placed the box among the offerings. "What's the story behind that piece?" asked George Morrison, Jake's brother and the evening's volunteer auctioneer. "It's just something I had no use for anymore," Ruthie replied, but her fingers lingered on the carved surface for a moment longer than necessary. Perhaps someone else might find it more suitable to their needs. The bidding was spirited, with the box eventually going to Dr. Peterson for $12, a considerable sum that drew murmurs of appreciation from the crowd. But Beau noticed how Ruthie's eyes followed the box as it was carried away, and the way her hands folded in her lap as if missing something familiar. When the dancing began, Beau offered his hand with the same confidence that had served him well in ballrooms from Chicago to San Francisco. But as they moved onto the small, cleared space that served as a dance floor, he discovered yet another layer to Ruthie's mystery. She danced like a woman born to it, her steps precise and graceful, her posture speaking of lessons learned in places where dancing was an art rather than merely entertainment. When the music called for a waltz, she followed his lead with the kind of natural elegance that made other couples look clumsy by comparison. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, as they moved through the familiar patterns. "I had good teachers once," she replied, and again there was that sense of history, of a life lived in circumstances very different from her current situation. As the evening wound toward its close, Beau found himself reluctant to see it end. The woman in his arms bore little resemblance to the shadowy figure he'd approached in the garden 3 days ago. This Ruthie Bell was intelligent, articulate, graceful, and mysteriously educated. She was also, he was beginning to realize, far more beautiful than he'd initially recognized. It wasn't the obvious beauty of youth or fashion, but something deeper, a quality of mind and spirit that transformed her weathered features into something compelling. When they stepped outside into the cool night air, the stars seemed particularly bright against the vast Montana sky. Beau offered to escort her home, but Ruthie declined with the same quiet firmness she'd shown when accepting his initial invitation. "I prefer to walk alone, Mr. Remington, but thank you for a lovely evening." "Beau," he said impulsively. "I'd be pleased if you called me Beau." She studied his face in the starlight, as if weighing the significance of the invitation. "Very well, Beau. And you may call me Ruth, if you like." Ruth. Not Ruthie, as the town had always known her, but Ruth, a name that carried dignity and substance. Another small revelation in an evening full of them. "Ruth," he repeated, finding he liked the sound of it. Would you allow me to call on you again? Perhaps we could take a drive tomorrow afternoon." The silence stretched between them, long enough for Beau to worry he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But then Ruth smiled, and the expression transformed her face completely. "I would like that," she said simply. As Beau walked back toward his horse, he found himself replaying the evening's conversations and trying to make sense of what he'd learned. The woman who'd sat beside him at dinner, who'd danced with unconscious grace, who'd spoken with quiet authority about education and literature and a dozen other topics. That woman didn't fit any of the stories the town had constructed around Ruthie Bell. More troubling still, she didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed around his own motivations. What had begun as a simple wager to prove his charm had become something else entirely, a genuine desire to understand this mysterious woman, and perhaps, if he was honest with himself, to see her again, for reasons that had nothing to do with $10 bets or wounded pride. The silver flask in his pocket felt heavier than ever as he mounted Thunder and rode home under the star-filled sky. Behind him, the lights of Bitter Creek twinkled like earthbound constellations, and somewhere among those lights, Ruth Bell was walking home with her secrets intact and her dignity uncompromised. Bo was beginning to suspect that winning this particular wager might cost him more than he'd ever imagined, and that the price might be worth paying. Sunday afternoon found Bo at Ruth's garden gate precisely at 2 o'clock, his best buggy polished until it gleamed, and his bay mare, Stella, prancing with restless energy. He'd spent the morning telling himself this was simply a continuation of the original wager, but the careful attention he'd paid to his appearance suggested otherwise. Ruth emerged from the small cabin behind the garden, wearing a simple grey dress and a shawl that, while still worn, seemed somehow different from the shapeless brown wrap she'd always worn before. As she approached the buggy, Bo noticed she carried a small bundle wrapped in clean linen. "I thought we might find a pleasant spot for a picnic," she said, her voice carrying that same musical quality he'd noticed the night before. "Unless you had other plans?" "A picnic sounds perfect," Bo replied, helping her into the buggy with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. As they drove out of town, he found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the elegant line of her nose and the way the afternoon light caught silver threads in her carefully arranged hair. They chose a spot beside Willow Creek, where the water ran clear over smooth stones, and a grove of cottonwoods provided dappled shade. As Ruth unpacked their modest meal, fresh bread, cheese, and early apples, Bo noticed something that made his breath catch. When she reached into her bundle, the sleeve of her dress rode up slightly, revealing a flash of delicate white fabric beneath. It was lace. Real lace, the kind that came from Europe and cost more than most people in Bitter Creek earned in a month. But it was the pattern that truly caught his attention. Intricate work that bore what looked like a family crest embroidered in silk thread, so fine it seemed like captured moonlight. "That's beautiful workmanship," he said, nodding toward her wrist as she quickly adjusted her sleeve. Ruth's hand flew to her cuff, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or old pain. "It's just an old handkerchief," she said quietly. "Something I've had for a long time." But Bo had seen enough fine things in his life to recognize quality when he saw it. That embroidered handkerchief represented the kind of wealth that made his cattle empire look modest, and the family crest, though he couldn't make out the details, suggested lineage that stretched back generations. "You don't have to explain anything to me, Ruth," he said gently. "We all carry pieces of our past." She studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him with something precious. "Do we? Sometimes I think the past carries us instead, like a river we can never quite escape." The sadness in her voice touched something deep in Bo's chest, and he found himself leaning forward with an intensity that surprised them both. "What river are you trying to escape?" Ruth was quiet for so long that Bo began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "Have you ever lost everything, Bo? Not just money or property, but everything that made you who you thought you were?" "No," he admitted. "I've been lucky that way. I thought I was lucky once, too." She picked up one of the apples and turned it slowly in her hands, studying its red skin as if it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. I had a family, a name that meant something, a future that seemed as solid as these mountains. What happened? Fire, she said simply. Fire takes more than buildings. It can take souls if you're not careful. Bo wanted to ask more, to understand the pain that shadowed her words, but something in her posture warned him to wait. Instead, he found himself talking about his own life, his own struggles, the pressure of living up to his family name, the loneliness that came with wealth, the way success could become its own kind of prison. Sometimes I think I built my whole life around proving I could have anything I wanted, he said, surprised by his own honesty. But wanting something and understanding its value aren't the same thing. No, Ruth agreed. They're not. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation meandered like the creek beside them, touching on books, philosophy, the changing face of the territory, and dreams both fulfilled and abandoned. Bo discovered that Ruth possessed not just intelligence, but wisdom, the kind that came from suffering transformed into understanding. When she mentioned reading Tennyson's latest work, Bo stared at her in amazement. How did you get a copy of Locksley Hall 60 years after? It was only published last year. Ruth's hand went instinctively to her embroidered cuff. I have my ways of keeping up with literature that matters to me. Another mystery. Books like that didn't just appear in isolated Montana settlements, especially not in the hands of women who supposedly lived in poverty. But before Bo could pursue the question, Ruth deflected with a question of her own. What do you dream about, Bo? When you're alone in that big house of yours, what do you wish for? The question caught him off guard with its directness. He'd never been asked what he dreamed about, only what he planned to accomplish or acquire. Lately, he said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. I dream about conversations like this one, about finding someone who sees past the money and the reputation to whatever's actually worth seeing underneath. Ruth's eyes met his across their simple picnic, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with wages or social expectations. It was recognition, two souls acknowledging something true and precious in each other. And you, Ruth? What do you dream about? I used to dream about going home, she said quietly. Now I think maybe home is something you build rather than something you return to. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they packed their simple meal and prepared to return to town. But as Bo helped Ruth into the buggy, she paused and looked back toward the creek. Thank you, she said, for treating me like a person worth knowing instead of a curiosity worth winning. The words hit Bo like a physical blow because they told him she knew, or at least suspected, the truth about how their acquaintance had begun. But there was no accusation in her voice, only a kind of gentle sadness that made him ashamed of the silver flask in his pocket and the men waiting to collect their $10 debts. Ruth, he began, but she shook her head. Not today, she said. Today was perfect as it was. As they drove back toward Bitter Creek in the gathering dusk, Bo realized that somewhere between the church hall and Willow Creek, his simple wager had transformed into something far more dangerous, genuine affection for a woman who deserved far better than the circumstances that had brought them together. The embroidered handkerchief remained hidden beneath Ruth's sleeve, but its implications traveled with them like an unspoken promise that more revelations would come. The weeks following their picnic settled into a pattern that surprised both Bo and the good people of Bitter Creek. Every Sunday after church, he would call on Ruth with his polished buggy, and they would disappear into the countryside for hours of conversation that left him feeling more alive than all his business successes combined. The town's reaction evolved from outright shock to grudging curiosity to something approaching acceptance. When Mrs. Peterson mentioned that Ruth had offered to tutor her struggling son in reading, and young Timothy had shown remarkable improvement, opinions began to shift. When Ruth quietly helped old widow Henley organize her late husband's papers and discovered an overlooked insurance policy that saved the woman's farm, whispers turned from suspicious to respectful. But it was Beau's own transformation that proved most startling to those who'd known him longest. The confident cattle baron who'd always treated the world like his personal domain began showing signs of vulnerability that no one had ever seen before. He lingered in town longer than necessary, hoping for glimpses of Ruth tending her garden. He defended her against casual slights with a ferocity that surprised even himself. "Never seen a man so thunderstruck," Charlie Henderson observed one evening at the Copper Dollar. "It's like watching a mountain move." But for all the progress in their courtship, Beau sensed depths in Ruth that remained carefully guarded. She would share stories of books she'd read, opinions on poetry that revealed sophisticated education, and observations about human nature that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Yet whenever the conversation approached her past directly, she would deflect with the skill of someone who'd had years to practice protecting painful truths. It was during their fourth Sunday ride that Beau caught a glimpse of something that deepened the mystery considerably. They'd driven further than usual, to a rise overlooking the valley where his cattle grazed like scattered dots across the autumn landscape. As Ruth gazed across the vast expanse, she pulled from her pocket a small object that caught the sunlight. "It's beautiful land," she said, turning the object in her fingers with unconscious familiarity. Beau's breath caught as he recognized what she held. A burned land deed, charred around the edges, but still partially legible. Though he couldn't make out the specific details from where he sat, the formal legal language was unmistakable, as was the official seal that marked it as a government document. "Ruth," he said carefully, "what is that you're holding?" She looked down as if surprised to find the document in her hands, then quickly folded it and tucked it back into her pocket. "Nothing important. Just old papers I should have thrown away years ago." But Beau had seen enough legal documents in building his empire to recognize significance when it appeared. That burned deed represented property, potentially valuable property, and the careful way Ruth handled it suggested it meant far more than she was willing to admit. "Old papers can sometimes be more valuable than people realize," he said gently. "If you ever wanted someone to look at them—" "No," Ruth said quickly, her voice carrying the first sharp note he'd ever heard from her. "Some things are better left buried." That evening, Beau found himself in his study, staring out at the lights of Bitter Creek and thinking about burned deeds and embroidered handkerchiefs and women who quoted Tennyson while living in poverty. The pieces of Ruth's puzzle were scattered before him like a deck of cards, but every time he thought he glimpsed the pattern, she would deflect or withdraw, leaving him with more questions than answers. His business was suffering from his distraction, though his foreman was too diplomatic to say so directly. Cattle prices needed negotiating, winter preparations required supervision, and a dozen other matters demanded his attention. But Beau found his thoughts constantly returning to conversations beside Willow Creek, and the way Ruth's eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. It was his cook, Maria, who finally voiced what others had been thinking. "Senor Beau," she said one evening, as she cleared his untouched dinner. "This woman, she has your heart, yes?" "It's complicated, Maria." "Love is always complicated," the elderly woman replied with the wisdom of someone who'd seen 3 generations of Remington men struggle with matters of the heart. "But some complications are worth the trouble. That night, Beau lay awake, thinking about complications, and wondering when exactly his feelings for Ruth had evolved beyond the original wager into something that felt dangerously close to love. The thought should have terrified him. Beauregard Remington III, who'd never been dependent on anyone for anything, was becoming emotionally dependent on a woman whose past remained largely a mystery. But instead of fear, he felt something he'd never experienced before. A desire to protect and cherish someone whose well-being had become more important than his own pride or comfort. The next morning brought news that would test both his growing feelings and Ruth's carefully maintained privacy. Jake Morrison approached him at the bank with information that would change everything. "Beau," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of significant news. "You know how you've been asking subtle questions about Ruth Bell's background? What have you found?" "Talked to my cousin over in Helena yesterday. He's been working with the Territorial Records Office, and some interesting documents have surfaced. Papers related to a family called McAllister. You ever hear that name?" Beau's heart began beating faster. McAllister was a name that carried weight throughout the territory, associated with mining fortunes and political influence that stretched back to the earliest days of settlement. "What kind of papers?" "Property deeds, mostly. Seems the McAllister family owned considerable holdings in this area before some kind of tragedy struck. Fire, from what my cousin gathered, killed most of the family and destroyed their estate." Jake paused, studying Beau's face with the intensity of a man who enjoyed being the bearer of significant news. "Thing is, there might have been a survivor, a daughter who disappeared around the time of the fire. No one knows what happened to her." The burned deed in Ruth's pocket suddenly took on new significance, as did the embroidered handkerchief and her sophisticated education and her familiarity with wealth and refinement. Pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture that took Beau's breath away. "Jake," he said quietly, "I need you to find out everything you can about the McAllister family. Everything. But keep it quiet. I don't want rumors spreading until we know for certain what we're dealing with. You think Ruth Bell might be. I think Ruth Bell might be someone very different from who this town believes her to be. And if I'm right, her reasons for hiding could be a matter of life and death." Jake Morrison's investigation consumed the next 2 weeks like a slow-burning fire. Each day brought new fragments of information about the McAllister family tragedy, and each revelation made Beau more certain that Ruth Bell was harboring secrets that could reshape everything he thought he knew about her. The McAllister estate had been magnificent, according to territorial records. A sprawling ranch house with formal gardens, a private library that rivaled anything in Denver, and holdings that stretched across 3 counties. The family had been among the wealthiest in the territory, with interests in mining, cattle, and the growing railroad industry. But on a September night in 1877, fire had consumed everything. The official report blamed faulty chimney work, but Jake's cousin had uncovered witness statements suggesting something more sinister. Neighbors had reported seeing riders fleeing the scene, and there were whispers of business disputes that had turned deadly. "The whole family was supposed to have died," Jake reported during one of their private meetings at the bank. "Elias McAllister, his wife Margaret, and their daughter. But here's the thing, they never found the daughter's body. Search went on for weeks, but she just vanished." "What was her name?" Beau asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Ruth Elizabeth McAllister. 20 years old at the time of the fire. By all accounts, she was beautiful, educated, and engaged to marry the son of a Denver banking family." Beau felt something cold settle in his stomach. Ruth Elizabeth. Not Ruth Bell, But Ruth McAllister, heiress to one of the territory's greatest fortunes, survivor of a tragedy that had stolen everything she'd ever known. But Jake's investigations were attracting attention beyond their small circle. Word had reached certain parties in Helena and Denver that someone was asking questions about the McAllister tragedy, and those questions were stirring up interest among people who'd assumed the matter was permanently closed. It was Dr. Peterson who brought the first warning, arriving at Bo's ranch on a Wednesday evening with news that made Bo's blood run cold. "Strange thing happened today," the doctor said, accepting a glass of whiskey in Bo's study. "Had a visitor asking about medical records from around the time of the McAllister fire. Well-dressed fellow from back east, claimed to be researching territorial history for some university project." "What kind of medical records?" "Specifically wanted to know if anyone had treated a young woman for burns or injuries around that time. Seemed particularly interested in whether such a woman might have survived but been left changed by the experience." Bo set down his glass with hands that weren't entirely steady. "What did you tell him?" "Told him the truth, that patient records are confidential, and I don't discuss them with strangers, university project or not. But Bo, something about this fellow didn't sit right. He was asking the kinds of questions a man asks when he's hunting something specific." That night, Bo made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for Sunday, he rode to Ruth's cabin under cover of darkness, his heart pounding with a mixture of love, fear, and desperate certainty. He found her in her garden despite the late hour, kneeling among the dying plants by the light of a small lantern. In her hands, she held a tarnished locket that she was polishing with gentle, reverent strokes. "Ruth," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and in the lamplight, he saw something in her face that confirmed his worst fears. Knowledge that time was running out, and with it, her carefully constructed safety. "Bo," she said, rising with the graceful movement he'd come to associate with her hidden refinement. "You shouldn't be here so late. People will talk." "Let them talk," he said, dismounting and approaching her with purpose that made her step back against the garden gate. "Ruth, I know who you are." The locket slipped from her fingers, falling to the earth with a soft thud. In the lantern light, Bo caught a glimpse of the miniature portrait inside, a man and woman who bore unmistakable resemblance to the woman standing before him, their faces painted with the kind of detail that spoke of wealth and position. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but her voice carried defeat rather than conviction. "Ruth Elizabeth McAllister," he said gently. "Daughter of Elias and Margaret McAllister, heiress to one of the greatest fortunes in the territory. Survivor of a fire that was supposed to have killed her along with her parents." Ruth's face crumpled as if he'd struck her, and she sank back against the gate with a sob that came from somewhere deep in her soul. "How did you find out? Does it matter?" Bo stepped forward and gathered her into his arms, feeling her small frame shake with years of suppressed grief and fear. "What matters is that you're in danger. People are looking for you, Ruth. People who thought you were dead and might prefer to keep it that way." "You don't understand," she said against his chest, her voice muffled by his coat. "They killed my parents, burned everything we'd built, everything we were. I've been hiding for 10 years, and if they find me—" "They won't," Bo said with fierce conviction. "I won't let them." Ruth pulled back to look at him, her face wet with tears that caught the lamplight like scattered diamonds. "You don't know what you're saying. These aren't people you can buy off or intimidate. They have connections, power, resources, and you're just one man." "I'm a man who loves you," Bo said, the words coming out with such certainty that they surprised them both. and I'm a man who has resources of his own. More importantly, I'm a man who won't stand by and watch the woman he loves live in fear." The declaration hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Ruth stared at him with wonder and terror warring in her expression, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. "You love me?" she whispered. "I love you," Bo confirmed. "I love your intelligence, your strength, your grace under impossible circumstances. I love the way you've survived what would have destroyed most people and still managed to keep your compassion intact. I love who you were, who you are, and who you're becoming." Ruth's hand went to the locket lying in the dirt, and when she looked back at Bo, something had changed in her expression, a hardening of resolve that spoke of decisions made and accepted. "If you truly love me," she said quietly, "then you'll help me do something I should have done years ago. It's time to stop running and start fighting back. But Bo, if we do this, there's no going back. Once we challenge them, they'll come for us both." Bo reached down and picked up the locket, placing it gently in Ruth's palm before closing her fingers around it. "Then we'd better make sure we win." The full revelation came 3 days later, delivered in a package that changed everything Bo thought he understood about wealth, power, and the woman he'd fallen in love with. Jake Morrison arrived at the ranch with documents that made even a man of Bo's considerable fortune feel suddenly small and insignificant. "Bo," Jake said, spreading the papers across the desk in the study, "you need to sit down for this." The inheritance documents were comprehensive, legal, and staggering in their implications. Ruth Elizabeth McAllister was not just the heir to a substantial fortune. She was the rightful owner of mineral rights, land holdings, and business interests that made Bo's cattle empire look like a modest family farm. "According to the territorial attorney's office," Jake explained, his voice hushed with awe, "the McAllister holdings were never legally transferred after the family's supposed death. The businesses were placed in trust, the land was administered by court appointees, but the actual ownership remained with any surviving heir." Bo studied the documents with growing amazement. Railroad shares, mining claims, timber rights, and property that stretched across half the territory. It was wealth beyond imagination, held in trust for a woman who'd been living in poverty because she was too afraid to claim what was rightfully hers. "There's more," Jake said, pulling out a separate folder. "The fire wasn't just about eliminating the family. It was about stealing their holdings. 3 men stand to lose everything if Ruth McAllister resurfaces to claim her inheritance." The names on the documents hit Bo like physical blows. Senator Harrison Walsh, the territorial representative who'd been pushing for statehood, Judge Marcus Crawford, whose court decisions had shaped property law throughout the region, and most shocking of all, railroad magnate Robert Eastman, a man Bo had done business with, a man he'd considered honorable. "They've been managing the McAllister estate for 10 years, Jake continued, drawing salaries as trustees, making decisions as if the property were theirs, building their own fortunes on what was supposed to be temporary stewardship. And if Ruth comes forward to claim her inheritance, they lose everything. More than that, they face charges for conspiracy, murder, and theft on a scale that would destroy them all." Bo felt the weight of the silver flask in his pocket and thought about the cruel irony of the situation. He'd approached Ruth as part of a foolish wager, assuming she was the poorest woman in Bitter Creek. Instead, she was potentially the wealthiest person in the entire territory. Wealthier than he was, wealthier than most people could imagine. But the documents also revealed why she'd been hiding, and why the mysterious investigators had appeared in town. Word of Jake's inquiries had reached the wrong ears, and the 3 men who'd built their lives on stolen wealth were taking steps to protect their secrets. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. "My cousin in Helena says there's been talk. Quiet talk, but serious. Someone's put out word that they're looking for information about a woman matching Ruth's description. They're offering money, substantial money, for anyone who can confirm her identity and location." Bo stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "We have to warn her. Tonight." But as they prepared to leave, a commotion outside drew their attention to the window. A cloud of dust on the horizon marked the approach of multiple riders, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested official business. "Damn," Jake muttered. "Looks like they found us before we found them." The riders proved to be a mixed group: territorial marshals, private investigators, and one man Bo recognized with a sinking heart. Robert Eastman himself had come to Bitter Creek, his presence lending weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as routine inquiry. They gathered in the town square like a storm cloud, their questions spreading through the community with the efficiency of a military operation. Who had been asking questions about the McAllister family? Had anyone seen unusual behavior from long-term residents? Was there any woman in the area whose background didn't quite match her current circumstances? Bo watched from his study window as the investigators methodically worked their way through town, knowing with sick certainty that it was only a matter of time before someone pointed them toward Ruth's humble cabin. The people of Bitter Creek were honest folk, and they had no reason to lie to men who carried official credentials and spoke with the authority of territorial law. "I have to get to her," Bo said, reaching for his gun belt. "That's exactly what they expect you to do," Jake warned. "They're probably watching her place already, waiting to see who shows up." As if summoned by his words, Dr. Peterson appeared at the ranch house door, his face grim with urgent news. "Bo, you need to know. They've got men positioned around the Hutchins place. I saw them when I was making my evening rounds. Professional men, the kind who know how to wait and watch." Bo felt trapped between love and logic, between the desperate need to protect Ruth and the cold reality that rushing to her aid might be exactly what her enemies wanted. But as the sun set over Bitter Creek, casting long shadows across the valley he'd always considered his domain, he knew that whatever happened next would determine not just Ruth's fate, but his own. The silver flask felt heavier than ever in his pocket as he made his decision. Love, he realized, required not just courage but wisdom, and sometimes wisdom meant taking risks that defied every logical calculation. "Jake," he said quietly, "I need you to create a distraction, something that will draw their attention away from Ruth's place for at least an hour." "What kind of distraction?" Bo smiled grimly, thinking of his considerable wealth and the influence it could buy. "The kind that involves a very public, very intoxicated cattle baron making a fool of himself at the Copper Dollar Saloon. Let them think I'm drowning my sorrows because I've learned something that's shaken my confidence. And while you're making a spectacle of yourself, I'll be doing what I should have done from the beginning, making sure the woman I love knows she's not alone in this fight." As night fell over Bitter Creek, the pieces of a decade-old conspiracy were finally moving toward their inevitable collision. Ruth Elizabeth McAllister was about to discover that her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered, that the inheritance she'd never dared claim was within her reach, and that the love she'd found in hiding might be strong enough to help her reclaim everything she'd lost. But first, she would have to survive the night, and the men who had killed her parents were very good at making sure their secrets stayed buried. The inheritance documents lay scattered across Bo's desk like promises of justice long delayed, while outside, the forces of greed and fear gathered for a confrontation that would determine whether truth and love could triumph over a decade of carefully constructed lies. The grandfather's gold pocket watch had been her father's most treasured possession, and Ruth held it now with trembling fingers as she prepared for what might be her final night of hiding. Beau's warning had reached her through Dr. Peterson's careful visit, and she knew the men who'd destroyed her family were closing in like wolves, scenting wounded prey. But for the first time in 10 years, Ruth Elizabeth McAllister felt ready to stop running. She moved through her small cabin with deliberate purpose, gathering the few items that truly mattered. The embroidered handkerchief went into a small leather pouch, along with the burned land deed and the inheritance documents she'd hidden beneath a loose floorboard for a decade. The tarnished locket containing her parents' portraits hung around her neck, warm against her heart. But it was the pocket watch that held the most power. Engraved on its golden surface was the McAllister family motto, Veritas Vincit, truth conquers. Her father had carried it through business dealings that built an empire, and her mother had wound it every morning for 25 years of marriage. Now Ruth wound it one final time, feeling its steady tick mark the seconds until her old life would either be reborn or buried forever. Outside, she could hear the subtle sounds that marked the presence of watchers, a boot scraping against stone, the soft whinny of a horse being restrained, the whispered conversation of men who thought they were being silent. They were professionals, these hunters, but Ruth had spent 10 years learning to listen for danger. She blew out her lamp and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains toward the town lights. Somewhere out there, Beau was creating the distraction that would give her a chance to reach the one place where she might find safety. The Remington Ranch, with its loyal hands and defensible position. The sound of breaking glass from the direction of the Copper Dollar Saloon told her Beau's performance had begun. Even at this distance, she could hear raised voices, laughter, and the kind of commotion that would draw every curious soul in Bitter Creek. It was a generous gesture from a man who was risking his reputation to save her life, and Ruth felt her heart swell with love that was mixed with terrible fear for his safety. A soft knock at her door made her freeze, every muscle tensed for flight, but the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Miss Ruth, it's Maria Vasquez. Senor Beau sent me." Ruth opened the door to find Beau's cook standing with a bundle of men's clothing and a determined expression that brooked no argument. "Quickly, señorita," Maria whispered. "We change your clothes, fix your hair. You must look like my nephew who comes to help in the kitchen." The transformation took only minutes, but Ruth was amazed by how completely it changed her appearance. With her grey hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat and her feminine curves hidden by loose work clothes, she looked like just another ranch hand heading home after a long day. "There is a horse waiting by the creek," Maria whispered as she gathered Ruth's discarded dress. "Follow the water north until you reach the big cottonwood, then ride hard for the ranch. Senor Beau will meet you there." "Maria," Ruth began, but the older woman shook her head. "No words, señorita. Just go, and remember, you are not running anymore. You are going home to fight." Ruth slipped out the back of the cabin and made her way through the darkness toward Willow Creek, her heart pounding with each step. The sounds from the saloon grew louder as Beau's performance reached its crescendo. She could hear him singing off-key ballads about love lost and fortune squandered, playing the part of a drunk cowboy to perfection. The horse Maria had promised was a sturdy bay mare, already saddled and ready for hard riding. Ruth swung into the saddle with movements that betrayed her years of finest riding instruction, then guided the horse along the creek bank toward the rendezvous point. Behind her, the cabin she'd called home for 10 years grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of reclaiming everything she'd lost. The pocket watch ticked steadily against her chest, marking time until truth would finally have its chance to conquer. But as she rode through the Montana night, Ruth was unaware that the distraction at the saloon had only partially succeeded. While most of the investigators had indeed been drawn to the spectacle of Beau's public intoxication, 2 men remained hidden in positions that gave them clear views of the cabin she'd just left. Senator Walsh's private investigators were experienced trackers, and they'd noticed the unusual activity around the modest dwelling. When they saw a figure slip out the back and head toward the creek, they followed at a careful distance, waiting to see where this late-night ride would lead. Beau's performance at the Copper Dollar was worthy of the finest theater stages. He stumbled through the bat-wing doors as if the weight of the world had just fallen on his shoulders, calling for whiskey in a voice loud enough to wake the dead. "Jake!" he bellowed, though the saloon keeper was standing just 3 feet away. "My friend Jake, pour me the finest whiskey you have, because tonight I drink to my own foolishness." The investigators who'd entered the saloon with him exchanged glances, clearly believing they were witnessing a man's public breakdown. Robert Eastman himself stood at the bar, studying Beau with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Having troubles, Remington?" Eastman asked with false sympathy. Beau turned to him with exaggerated surprise, swaying slightly as if the bourbon had already done its work. "Troubles? Me? No, sir. No troubles at all. Just discovered that everything I thought I knew about a certain lady was wrong. Dead wrong." He pulled out the silver flask and set it on the bar with a clatter that made everyone in the saloon turn to look. "This flask belonged to my grandfather, you know. He used to tell me it would bring me luck in business and love." Well, the business part worked out fine. But the love? He laughed bitterly. "Turns out the woman I've been courting isn't who I thought she was at all." Eastman leaned forward with interest that seemed carefully casual. "Women can be mysterious creatures. What did you discover about this lady that's got you so upset?" Beau took a long drink straight from the flask, letting whiskey spill down his chin for effect. "Discovered she's been lying to me about everything. Her name, her background, her circumstances. Makes a man wonder what else she's been hiding." The words were carefully chosen to suggest he'd learned Ruth's true identity, but was too hurt and drunk to pose any immediate threat. Around the saloon, the investigators relaxed slightly, believing they were dealing with a spurned lover rather than a protective conspirator. But Beau was counting seconds in his head, calculating how much time Ruth would need to reach safety. Every minute he kept these men entertained was another minute for her to put distance between herself and the hunters who'd killed her family. "Another round for everyone," he declared, his voice carrying the kind of false cheer that comes with expensive liquor and expensive disappointment. "Tonight we drink to the truth, whatever the cost." Meanwhile, at the Remington Ranch, loyal hands were taking positions that would turn the sprawling property into a fortress. These were men who'd ridden with Beau through cattle wars and harsh winters, and their loyalty ran deeper than mere employment. When word came that their boss was in trouble and needed their guns, they responded with the efficiency of a military unit. The ranch house itself sat on high ground, with clear sight lines in all directions, and the bunkhouse could shelter a dozen men with rifles. More importantly, Beau's reputation and wealth had earned him allies throughout the territory, judges, sheriffs, and honest officials who would support him against men they'd never trusted. As Ruth rode through the darkness toward what might be either salvation or a final confrontation, the pocket watch continued its steady rhythm against her chest. Each tick brought her closer to a moment that would determine whether 10 years of hiding had been for nothing, or whether love and justice could triumph over greed and murder. The grandfather's watch had kept perfect time through her father's life and her mother's death, through the fire that destroyed everything and the long years of exile that followed. Now it would mark the hours until Ruth Elizabeth McAllister either reclaimed her birthright or died trying. In the distance, the lights of the Remington ranch beckoned like a promise of hope, while behind her, the darkness held dangers that had been hunting her for a decade. The final act was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether truth was indeed strong enough to conquer the lies that had ruled her life for far too long. The confrontation began at dawn, with the arrival of official-looking men carrying federal warrants and territorial authority. Ruth had reached the safety of the Remington ranch just hours before, and now she stood in the main house parlor, wearing a simple blue dress that Maria had found for her, her father's gold pocket watch chain visible against the dark fabric. More importantly, she wore the McAllister family ring. Beau had given it to her just before sunrise, producing it from a safe where he'd kept it since Jake's investigation had uncovered its existence among the territorial records. The heavy gold signet bore the family crest and the motto Veritas Vincit engraved in flowing script, tangible proof of her identity that no amount of false documentation could dispute. "Miss Bell," called Robert Eastman from the front porch, his voice carrying the confident authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. Or should I say, the woman claiming to be Ruth McAllister. "I'm here with territorial marshals and federal investigators. We need to speak with you about some very serious allegations." Ruth moved to the window, her hand instinctively going to the watch chain at her throat. Through the glass, she could see a small army of men positioned around the ranch, some wearing badges, others clearly private investigators, all armed and ready for resistance. But she could also see Beau's ranch hands, taking defensive positions of their own. Loyal men with rifles who'd die before they'd let harm come to their boss or his lady. "Mr. Eastman," Ruth called back, her voice carrying across the morning air with surprising strength. "I believe you already know who I am, or you wouldn't be here." Eastman stepped closer to the house, flanked by 2 territorial marshals whose faces showed the uncomfortable expressions of men caught between conflicting authorities. "The woman known as Ruth McAllister died in a fire 10 years ago," Eastman declared. "Whatever game you're playing here, it ends now. Come out peacefully, and we'll discuss this matter in a civilized fashion." "Actually," said a new voice from behind the assembled men, "I think we need to discuss what happened the night of that fire." Everyone turned to see Jake Morrison approaching with a group that included Judge Harrison from the county seat, Sheriff Williams, and Dr. Peterson. More importantly, Jake carried a leather satchel that seemed to make Eastman visibly nervous. "Judge Harrison," Eastman said quickly, "this is territorial business. I'm not sure county authority applies here." "It applies when someone brings me evidence of murder and conspiracy," Judge Harrison replied grimly. He was an older man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his hatred of corruption. "Mr. Morrison has presented some very disturbing documents to my court." Jake opened the satchel and withdrew papers that rustled in the morning breeze like leaves carrying secrets. "Witness statements from the night of the McAllister fire," he announced. "Statements that were mysteriously omitted from the official investigation 10 years ago." Ruth felt her heart stop, then start again with painful intensity. Witnesses? A traveling preacher who saw armed riders leaving the McAllister property the night of the fire, Jake continued. a railroad worker who overheard 3 men planning what they called removing an obstacle to progress. And most damning of all, a deathbed confession from a hired gun who couldn't take his secrets to the grave. The confession, Jake explained, named names and described payments. It detailed how the McAllister family had discovered irregularities in territorial land deals, irregularities that would have exposed a conspiracy involving Senator Walsh, Judge Crawford, and Robert Eastman himself. "These are lies," Eastman snarled, but his confidence was cracking like ice under spring sun. "Fabrications designed to support an elaborate fraud." "Then you won't mind if we examine this," Ruth said, stepping out onto the porch with quiet dignity. She held up her hand, and the McAllister family ring caught the morning light like captured fire. The crest was unmistakable, the workmanship unique, and the way it fit her finger spoke of inheritance rather than theft. "This ring was made for my great-grandfather by a craftsman in Philadelphia," Ruth said, her voice carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "The inside is engraved with a date that corresponds to his wedding to my great-grandmother. No one but a family member would know that detail." Judge Harrison stepped forward, his experienced eye studying the ring with the attention it deserved. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "Miss McAllister," he said formally, "would you be willing to accompany me to the county courthouse to make an official statement regarding your identity and the events of 10 years ago?" "I would be honored, Your Honor." But as Ruth prepared to step down from the porch and finally reclaim her birthright, Robert Eastman made the mistake that would seal his fate. His hand moved toward the gun at his belt, a movement that was seen and understood by every man present. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Beau said quietly, appearing beside Ruth with his own weapon drawn. Around the yard, the sound of rifles being cocked echoed like deadly punctuation. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, with 10 years of secrets balanced on the edge of violence or justice. Ruth's hand closed around her father's pocket watch, feeling its steady tick mark the seconds until truth would finally have its day. The standoff lasted only seconds before Robert Eastman's survival instincts overcame his desperation. Faced with a dozen armed ranch hands and the clear evidence of his guilt, he slowly raised his hands and stepped back from his weapon. "This proves nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't build a case on deathbed confessions and old jewelry." "Actually, we can," Judge Harrison replied, signaling for Sheriff Williams to take custody of Eastman, especially when combined with financial records that show how the McAllister holdings have been systematically looted for the past decade. Jake Morrison pulled additional documents from his satchel, spreading them on a makeshift table formed by saddles and blankets. The papers told a story of greed, corruption, and carefully planned theft that made even the hardened lawmen shake their heads in disgust. "Bank transfers," Jake explained to the assembled crowd. "Land sales at prices far below market value. Mining rights transferred to shell companies controlled by the very men who were supposed to be protecting the McAllister interests. 10 years of systematic theft, all documented in their own records." Ruth stepped down from the porch, her hand steady on the family Bible that had been salvaged from the ruins of the McAllister estate. It was the final piece of evidence, a book that contained the complete family history, including birth records, marriage certificates, and genealogical information that definitively proved her identity. "This Bible has been in the McAllister family for 4 generations, she said, opening it to reveal pages of careful handwriting in fading ink. "My birth is recorded here, along with my parents' marriage and my grandparents' deaths. No imposter could have created this level of documentation." Dr. Peterson stepped forward to examine the book with the careful attention of a man trained to evaluate evidence. After several minutes, he looked up with satisfaction. "The handwriting matches samples we have from McAllister family documents in the territorial archives," he announced. "The ink age is consistent with the claimed dates, and the paper shows appropriate aging. This is genuine family documentation." With each piece of evidence, the case against the conspirators grew stronger, and their protestations grew weaker. Senator Walsh's representatives had already begun distancing themselves from the investigation, and Judge Crawford's name was conspicuously absent from the warrants that had brought the federal marshals to Bitter Creek. "Your Honor," Ruth said, addressing Judge Harrison with the dignity that had always been her birthright, "I formally request that the Territorial Court recognize my identity as Ruth Elizabeth McAllister and restore my inheritance as the sole surviving heir of the McAllister estate." "The court so recognizes," Judge Harrison replied solemnly. "Miss McAllister, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I hereby declare you the rightful heir to all properties, holdings, and assets held in trust since the death of your parents." The words fell into the morning air like the final notes of a long, complex symphony. After 10 years of hiding, fear, and carefully constructed anonymity, Ruth Elizabeth McAllister was officially herself again. But it was Beau who stepped forward with the gesture that meant more than all the legal declarations combined. He dropped to one knee beside the makeshift table, pulling from his pocket a simple gold band that caught the morning sunlight. "Ruth Elizabeth McAllister," he said, his voice carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "I love you not because of your wealth or your name, but because of who you are. The strongest, most graceful woman I've ever known. Will you marry me?" The proposal sent murmurs of approval through the crowd of ranch hands, townspeople, and even some of the federal marshals who had come expecting to witness an arrest, but instead found themselves watching justice and love triumph together. Ruth looked down at the man who had started as a stranger, making a foolish wager, and had become her salvation, her protector, and her heart's desire. In her hands, the family Bible seemed to pulse with the approval of generations of McAllister ancestors who had known true love when they saw it. "Yes," she said simply, and the word seemed to echo across the valley like a promise of better days ahead. As Beau slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, beside the heavy family signet, Ruth felt the weight of her father's pocket watch against her chest. The steady tick that had marked 10 years of exile was now counting toward a future she had never dared imagine. A future where truth had indeed conquered, where love had proven stronger than fear, and where the woman who had been called the ugliest in Bitter Creek was revealed as the territory's greatest heiress and the luckiest bride-to-be. The conspirators were led away in chains, their decade of stolen prosperity ended by the courage of a woman who had finally stopped running and the love of a man who had seen past appearances to the treasure hidden beneath. As the crowd began to disperse, preparing for what would become the most celebrated wedding in Montana Territory's history, Ruth and Beau stood together on the porch of the ranch that would soon be their shared home, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold with the promise of new beginnings. 6 months later, the wedding bells of Bitter Creek's Methodist Church rang out across the valley with a joy that seemed to lift the very mountains toward heaven. Ruth Elizabeth McAllister. Remington stood beside her husband in the same church where she had once hidden in shadows, now radiant in ivory silk that had been her grandmother's, and wearing the new wedding rings that symbolized not just their union, but the triumph of love over every obstacle that had tried to keep them apart. The transformation of both bride and groom was remarkable to witness. Ruth had blossomed from the weathered, silent woman who tended gardens in solitude into a confident lady whose intelligence and grace commanded respect throughout the territory. But more importantly, she had retained the compassion and wisdom that suffering had taught her, using her restored wealth to help others who faced hardship and injustice. Bo had changed as well, his cocky confidence maturing into genuine leadership, and his surface charm deepening into the kind of character that drew people to him, not for what he owned, but for who he had become. The silver flask still resided in his vest pocket, but now it held not liquid courage, but pressed wild flowers from their first picnic, a reminder of the day he'd begun to understand the difference between wanting something and truly valuing it. The church overflowed with guests who represented every corner of their lives. Cattlemen and miners sat beside former servants from the McAllister estate who had traveled from Denver to witness their young mistress's happiness. Federal judges shared pews with ranch hands, and even some of the investigators who had initially hunted Ruth now attended as friends, having learned the truth about the conspiracy they had unknowingly served. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with the special joy that comes from witnessing love overcome seemingly impossible odds. His voice carried clearly as he spoke about the mysterious ways that Providence sometimes uses our worst mistakes to lead us to our greatest blessings. "When a foolish wager brings two souls together," he said, his words reaching every corner of the packed church, "we can only marvel at how wisdom works through folly, and how love sees treasure where the world sees only hardship." The reception that followed was held on the grounds of the rebuilt McAllister estate, where Ruth's family home had risen from the ashes like something from a fairy tale. But this new house, while grand, was also welcoming, designed to be a home for family rather than just a display of wealth. In the garden where Ruth had once hidden her secrets, long tables now groaned under the weight of celebration. Children played among the same flowers she had tended in solitude, their laughter a promise that this place would know joy again after years of sorrow. It was Charlie Henderson who finally brought up the subject that everyone remembered, but none had dared mention. Raised by good whiskey and surrounded by friends both old and new, he stood and lifted his glass with the ceremonial gravity the moment deserved. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his weathered voice carrying across the garden, "I think it's time we all admitted something. 6 months ago, some of us made what might have been the worst bet in the history of Montana Territory." Laughter rippled through the crowd as people remembered the original wager that had brought Bo and Ruth together. Even Ruth smiled, her hand finding Bo's as Charlie continued his speech. "We dared this man to court the woman we called the ugliest in Bitter Creek," Charlie said, his voice growing serious. "Shows how much we knew about seeing true beauty. Turns out we were pointing him toward the most beautiful woman any of us had ever met. We were just too blind to recognize it." Tommy Garrett, now a married man himself, stood and raised his own glass. "I motion that we officially declare that bet the best wager ever made in this territory, seeing as how it brought together the two people who were obviously meant for each other all along." The toast that followed was enthusiastic and heartfelt, but it was Ruth who had the final word on the subject of their unusual courtship. "The funny thing about that wager," she said, rising with the natural grace that had always been hers, "is that Bo wasn't the only one who won something unexpected. When he offered his arm to the woman everyone pitied, he gave me something I'd lost 10 years ago. The courage to believe that someone might see me as worth knowing, not just worth helping." She looked around the garden at faces that had become dear to her. People who had learned to see past appearances and assumptions to the truth underneath. Sometimes, she continued, her voice carrying the wisdom that came from surviving the worst and finding the best, what looks like the end of your story is really just the beginning of a better chapter. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is exactly the person you need to find. As the evening settled into the comfortable rhythm of good friends celebrating life's unexpected gifts, Ruth and Bo walked together through the garden where their love had first begun to grow. The new wedding rings caught the last light of sunset, but it was the simple gold band on Ruth's finger that held the most meaning, not because of its value, but because of the love it represented and the future it promised. The pocket watch that had belonged to her father ticked steadily in its place of honor on the mantelpiece inside, marking time not for a woman in hiding, but for a family that would carry the McAllister name into a future bright with possibility. Truth had indeed conquered. Love had transformed tragedy into triumph, and what had begun as the cruelest of wagers had become the sweetest of love stories, one that would be told and retold in Bitter Creek for generations to come. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky, witnesses to another chapter in the ongoing story of the American West, where dreams could be lost and found, where love could bloom in the most unlikely places, and where sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst mistakes we ever made.